Good afternoon. I'm Melanie Thornton. I'm the Executive Director of the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs. We're delighted to be hosting this live stream event with the Minister of Trade, the Minister for Trade and Export Growth, the Honourable David Parker, and the Associate Minister for Trade and Export Growth, the Honourable Nanaia Mahuta. The COVID-19 pandemic has been a huge challenge for this country, and we'll need trade to drive our recovery from the economic fallout that's ensued. So it's going to be vital today to hear about this trade recovery strategy. Before we commence, I'm going to just run through what will happen today. Minister Parker will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then he and the Associate Minister will participate in a 20-minute Q&A with our trade expert, Sarah Patterson. Sarah's worked on agriculture and trade issues for almost 20 years. She's taught trade policy to officials, as well as representing New Zealand in WTO disputes. The event will be recorded and will be on NZIIA's website and YouTube channels, as well as on MFAT's YouTube channels and website. There will also be further details on MFAT's website. The Minister will release the full text of his speech following this event, and there will be opportunities for you to find out more about the details in the strategy. Over to you, Minister.
Thanks, Sarah, for chairing this event, and Melanie for that introduction, and thanks for those people who've come along, an enormous audience. Before I get to our trade recovery strategy, I want to tell you a bit about the work we did when the crisis hit and how New Zealand's trade policy has responded to the COVID crisis. As the crisis unfolded internationally, I think we were all alarmed at the sudden uptick in protectionist measures. At one point, nearly 80 World Trade Organization members had notified more than 100 new restrictions or other barriers in place. To make matters worse, some of the major economies began to introduce further subsidies for their farmers. The direction of travel was worrying. We were intensely focused on protecting New Zealand's trade and supply links. This was to ensure that New Zealand could continue to access essential goods, medicines, personal protection equipment, COVID-19 test kits and so on, as well as keeping New Zealand goods flowing to our trading partners. For example, the New Zealand-Singapore air freight project is an example, and it's helped us access essential medical supplies brought in through Singapore, while at the same time meeting Singapore's food security needs with New Zealand's agricultural exports. In terms of wider trade policy, our immediate response to the crisis has been a combination of energetic trade diplomacy and reform. One of my first calls was to my Singaporean colleague. Together we agreed that as a small trade-dependent countries, we couldn't stand by as the old certainties about the benefits of trade were washed away. And we committed to push back together on what we were seeing unfolding internationally. Within 24 hours, we had a bilateral statement issued, and 3 working days later, 7 other countries, including our closest partner and other P4 partners, Brunei and Chile, they all joined us along with the G7 economy, Canada and others. We all agreed to sustain trade and supply chain connectivity, particularly for essential medical goods and foods, and that statement now has 11 participants. The joint statement was important because it sent a signal about the contribution international trade can make to address the challenges we face with COVID-19. In short, we were making real my firm belief that international cooperation, not national protectionism, is the best way to address a global challenge. With signatories to the statement growing both in numbers and the collective economic heft represented, we're also demonstrating that New Zealand isn't alone in this belief. In practical terms, New Zealand also immediately gave effect to the statement by unilaterally suspending tariffs on medical and PPE-related goods. In some countries, tariffs on imported medical equipment and supplies are hindering their COVID response by increasing the cost of those goods through tariffs. Alongside this unilateral action, and in parallel with the joint ministerial statement, we also concluded a negotiation on essential COVID-19 goods with Singapore. The New Zealand-Singapore Declaration on Trade in Essential Goods removed tariffs and expedites trade flows on a wide range of COVID-19 response-related products. Again, this gave real substance to the objectives of the earlier joint substance. We also joined another ministerial statement together with Singapore, Canada, South Korea and Australia, aimed at facilitating the flow of goods and services as well as the movement of essential workers. In addition to reiterating our commitment to avoiding supply chain disruptions and protectionist trade measures, we also opened the door to working together to eventually facilitate the resumption of essential cross-border travel, while still, of course, safeguarding public health goals. These initiatives are all important counterpoints to the array of restrictions that we've seen some countries rush to implement. And while we were doing this, we were also working on the nuts and bolts of international trade. We were looking to resuscitate our air links and connectivity by standing up air freight facilities to support trade flows at the same time. This followed on from various ministers calling various airlines and countries as the crisis unfolded, when we discussed the desirability of all countries doing their bit to sustain air and sea transport links. In addition to meeting New Zealand's critical trade needs as the crisis unfolded, it was about laying the foundation stones for our short to medium term trade recovery strategy, which involves a significant recalibration of our approach to trade policy. In my opinion, most countries will consider whether increased stockpiles or local manufacturing capacity of some medicines, PCR testing reagents and personal protection equipment is needed. This is already provided for under our trade agreements, but this does not mean that we will in New Zealand manufacture our own cars or computers. We will remain reliant on trade to export what we produce well in order to fund the imports we need. So there is no question that trade will be a critical enabler of post-COVID-19 economic recovery. Who that trade is with depends on reciprocal relationships. It's important, with 1 in 4 of New Zealanders' jobs dependent on exports, and our knowledge that exporting firms are generally more productive, employ more staff and pay better wages. It's clear that rebuilding our international connectivity in general, for our tradable sector in particular, can help drive our recovery, including an expansion in employment incomes, innovation and productivity. The trade recovery strategy that I'm outlining today sets out how we're going to achieve that, from helping businesses get through the disruption of a global pandemic to recalibrating trade policy to navigate a turbulent environment. We want to protect the global trade systems and rules that have served New Zealand so well over many years and ensure that we are best placed to seize new opportunities for export and investment. None of us are under any illusion about the scale of the task. The current global shock from COVID-19 is both a demand and a supply side shock, and that makes it particularly challenging for all countries, including New Zealand, which is an open and internationally connected economy. The World Trade Organization trade forecasts predict that world merchandise trade will reduce by between 13 and 32% in 2020. The OECD estimated in April that on average the drop in economic output in each country caused by COVID-19 is equivalent to a decline of GDP of 2% for each month that strict virus containment measures continue. I suppose that illustrates, amongst other things, how lucky we are that at least at this stage of the COVID pandemic we're through the worst of that first surge. The trade challenges caused by COVID-19 are occurring against a backdrop of what were already turbulent times. Even before COVID-19 hit, the golden weather for New Zealand trade policy, which we enjoyed between 1995 and 2019, had well and truly ended. Our long-term trade strategy was designed to be able to adapt by shifting our points of emphasis for precisely the kinds of challenges that we see ahead of us today. It's one of the reasons why we've got this big and somewhat complex network of trade agreements. Now, as we face greater headwinds from nationalism and rising protectionism, which both become more pervasive and entrenched, global demand drops, businesses look to shorten supply chains, and travel restrictions affect tourism and education. Looking at our own statistics, we can see there are challenges ahead, but with the right trade recovery strategy and by working closely with exporters to ensure that strategy reflects their needs and priorities, we can navigate through this. Our overall goods exports, concentrated in the primary sector, have remained largely steady through the pandemic, although there was a 4% dip for the month of April compared with the previous year. According to the provisional figures from 1 February to 13 May, goods exports were valued at $18.1 billion, only slightly down on the $18.3 billion for the same period in 2019, and still at record levels compared to all other years. By contrast, goods imports have dropped significantly during the same period from $17 billion to $15.7 billion. The decline is accounted for predominantly by non-agricultural goods. Our key exporting services sectors, education and tourism, have of course been very hard hit by unnecessary border restrictions and actually by COVID ahead of those border restrictions. Overseas visitor arrivals in April were virtually zero, compared with 307,000 people arriving in April last year. A 2021 global trade recovery is predicted, and I'm optimistic that will be the case for New Zealand as well. Much hinges, though, on the duration of the pandemic international and how effective trading nations are in responding to it. For New Zealand's part, we'll be implementing our trade recovery strategy designed to get our export sector back up and running and contributing to the wider economic recovery. There are three interrelated elements to the strategy, and I want to go into a little detail of these. First is supporting exporters. We've allocated an additional $216 million over 4 years to NZTE in last month's budget, and this will enable them to offer in-market services to twice as many exporters. They currently focus on 700 high-growth firms. That has doubled to 1,400, with improved internet-based services for other exporters. This is combined with an emphasis on cross-agency support to help businesses both offshore and in New Zealand, and that support comes from MFAT and other agencies. These things will help the export sector weather the disruptions brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic, and it strengthens the role of trade and our exporters as a driver of economic growth. The second part of our strategy is to reinvigorate international trade architecture. COVID-19 and the worrying trend towards protectionism that it has exacerbated have reinforced New Zealand's need for a functioning rules-based international system. We'll be working to shore up the World Trade Organization as well as expanding and developing our network of regional and bilateral FTAs. Speaking of bilateral negotiations, I do want to mention recent news of a supposedly leaked agricultural access offer on the EU FTA negotiations. I'm disappointed both by the leak, but even more disappointed by the quality of what we're being offered. Let me be very clear. This latest offer from the European Union reflects agricultural protectionism in the European Union. It is a very negative signal, especially at a time when we're working together in the World Trade Organization and elsewhere, encouraging countries not to be protectionist and to ensure trade can flow freely between us. For New Zealand exporters to face such an uneven playing field in the European Union is really unacceptable. To take one example, in terms of the recent leaked offer, in 2019, the European Union exported to us here, tariff-free, the equivalent of just under a kilogram of cheese per New Zealander to New Zealand. By comparison, the EU is offering access for just over 3 grams of New Zealand cheese per EU citizen. Even then, it's subject to volume restrictions and highly prohibitive tariffs. This is not a workable way to conclude our long-running negotiations. Currently, the EU has a 2-to-1 trade surplus in goods with New Zealand. As a country, we cannot afford that situation to remain. It is clear that the EU will need to address this imbalance. I ask, how else post-COVID would New Zealand maintain a social licence for trade? I'm speaking tonight with my counterpart, the European Union Trade Commissioner Hogan, to register very clearly my dissatisfaction and disappointment with this offer, as well as the fact of its leak. The next aspect to our trade recovery project is refreshing key trading relationships. The disruptions caused by COVID have highlighted the importance of providing our exporters with access to a wide range of markets. While the decisions about where to export and how to diversify are ultimately down to the private sector exporters themselves, providing new or expanded access through our forward pipeline of free trade negotiations to markets like the EU, of which I've already spoken, the United Kingdom and South America, will give them more options to work with. Our trade recovery strategy is underpinned by our Trade for All agenda as we respond to social and economic well-being impacts of COVID-19. Late last year, the Trade for All Advisory Board presented a series of recommendations on how New Zealand trade policy can deliver better for all New Zealanders. The work that we were doing to respond to these recommendations just before the lockdown is reflected on how we're approaching the trade recovery strategy. I strongly believe that we need to trade to get us through this crisis, but I also believe that trade must work for all New Zealanders. The short to medium term trade recovery strategy that's already been outlined will help us with that. I don't have any further comments to make at this stage, and happy to move to questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Minister, for those opening remarks. There's a lot of food for thought in there, but perhaps Minister Mahuta, I could come to you first and would welcome some of your reflections on some of the issues talked about, and in particular how this fits in with the Trade for All policy that the government has.
Well, when I think about the Māori economy and what it can do through a very difficult circumstance of responding to COVID, but also what economic recovery looks like. There are three key pillars of the recovery strategy which will bode well for the Māori economy: support for business, both domestically but also in order for export businesses to be able to go back into the market. I think that is going to be a critical pillar and contribution of how MFAT and other agencies are going to reorient what they do right now that will inevitably help the Māori economy. The second pillar of the recovery strategy is around the rules-based system, and as a small country that is pushing out and continues to punch above our weight in terms of advocating for what we do really well and gaining more value from what we do really well. And I think, again, for Māori, it's in the primary sector: food and fibre, beverage, continuing to maintain vigilance on the trade agreements and how that derives advantage to the SME sector, I think will be good for Māori as well. And then the third part of the pillar is around relationships and deepening relationships. And I think we are in unexplored territory about how Māori can provide another entry point for how relationships could look in a post-COVID environment, because there are many characteristics around the Māori economy that I think is of value to New Zealand. The resilience of how Māori are participating certainly in the primary sector, the intergenerational perspective, the climate aware kind of reorientation in agricultural practices underpinned by our strategy here in New Zealand, they all bode well. So the relationships that we might be able to forge in markets where there is a high value on that intergenerational long-term perspective could be just another area where we can reach out and reach into the types of agreements we have with countries. So, there are challenges. The recovery strategy affords us opportunity in particular to work with the SME sector, of which Māori make up a key part. And as we build our brand value, our story, and we add that to what we want to continue to send to market in a post-COVID context, I think Māori are responding well to the opportunity ahead. But then we would expect that, because Māori are a part of the New Zealand economy and integrated.
How do you see Māori enterprises and Māori business participating in helping to implement this strategy going forward?
Well, during COVID, like Minister Parker I took soundings across a broad section of the Māori productive sector, and what they were identifying is that because we are invested in the long term in the way in which we pivot in a post-COVID context, we're looking to the value aspects of how we might be able to ensure that we gain more value as we're reorienting during this period of time. They were talking about areas of specialised processing and manufacturing as a real opportunity on the back of the government leaning into R&D and opportunities to add value to their contribution. So they're very optimistic. They know there's a challenge ahead. And I think that, again, forebodes well for the New Zealand economic recovery.
Minister Parker, would you like to add anything more about how you see that support to exporters creating benefit for them, what that will look like?
I think the most practical things we've done at the start were actually ensuring air flight links were maintained. Sea transport's been running pretty well, although there was some nervousness around that. I suspect that's abating a little. In respect of the exporters from New Zealand who can't travel to their export markets, they're more reliant on third-party representation of their interests offshore. And therefore the advice services that are provided both by MFAT but also NZTE become relatively more important for them, which is why we've effectively funded them to double the number of companies that they can give intensive services to, and also providing internet-based services for the others for whom we don't have that same level of service. In respect of longer-term issues, really trade access is important. We've had a bit of a frustrating day on that in New Zealand, I've got to say. We're one of the last liberal democracies in the world not to have a free trade agreement with the European Union. And if what we're seeing from this leak is correct, well, it's a derisory offer, which just won't close that agreement. And as I said in that speech, you can feel how strongly I feel that, because I personally think Europe needs this agreement more than we do. And they're not going to get an agreement on those terms because it will be patently unfair. And if we can't get, after all these decades of negotiation with the European Union, to a decent point, then they might like to think about what the alternatives will be in terms of the strength of their trading relationship with New Zealand, which currently runs in their favour at 2-1. Notwithstanding that particular hiccup in that negotiation, we continue. We don't give up on these negotiations, and we try to find out endpoints that are satisfactory to both sides. I'd finally make the point in respect of that every country that New Zealand has a sound trading relationship with, based on a decent trade agreement, whether it's Australia, China, ASEAN countries or CPTPP countries, our trade's broadly in balance and it's fair. The countries with whom we have, in general, unless it's a relationship that's founded on one particular commodity, all our relationships in the world are fair, where we have fair trade relationships, and they're generally, like in the European Union, more unfair where we don't have one.
Both of you have touched on the importance of relationships, and ultimately trade does come down to relationships between people and businesses and governments. How, in this new environment where people-to-people connections are quite difficult, how does New Zealand maintain its global connectivity and strengthen its relationships?
Well, when I think about the opportunity we have on the back of our domestic response to COVID, and a country that people can trust will make the best decision for people, I think the world is looking at that response and rethinking the way in which their relationship could be deepened in New Zealand. But we've also got a lot of advantages in terms of the story of how we produce products that go to market, and being really clear about the integrity of that. And I think there is a value in that. I know that Māori are very clear about the story attributed to what they produce, kai, in the food space and the value that people attribute to that. The other aspect is our story as a country, I think, is a story that cuts across many universal principles, such as sustainability, kaitiakitanga, our ability to care for people and our land and our waters. Those are all universal attributes that only add value to what New Zealand has to offer on the international market.
The only thing I would add to that is, as Nanai's already said, the New Zealand story exemplifies those attributes that underpin our brand proposition to the world, and we're refreshing that at the moment, and one of the things that we'll be leveraging off that is New Zealand's reliability when it comes to science and technology, which is amplified by how successful our science-based response to COVID-19 has been. So we would hope that New Zealand's reputation in the world will be further enhanced as a consequence of how the team of 5 million has helped get us this far.
When you think about the rising concern that we've had as we've seen more protectionism come through, obviously New Zealand, it's the team of 5 million, but in the world we're quite a small team, and there's some very big challenges. You alluded to the fact that going into this crisis there were already some challenges in terms of the WTO, our dispute settlement system and the rules-based trading system. How do you see this strategy taking us forward there, and what's the role that New Zealand can play?
Well, you know, we've long had a reputation for fairness, and it's when you read books about the body politic in New Zealand, New Zealand's more about fairness than we are about certain other attributes that have ascendancy in other countries, and that fairness transcends our trade policy as well. On the other hand, we don't like to be taken advantage of. I really don't know how trade is going to end at the end of all this. It really depends more on other countries than it does on New Zealand. We will continue to work projecting ourselves into the world with our traditional strong partners, Australia, Singapore, Chile, the other countries that I've mentioned that have signed up to those agreements that we've already negotiated during COVID. But I think it's as yet unclear where the world lands. I think it's notable at the end of World War II that countries that wanted to find peace in the world thought that the fair share to resources and growth opportunities afforded by trade were an important part of the long-term peacefulness and prosperity of the world, and I remain of that view, that that's still true. But it worries me that we have such strong protectionism on the rise around the world, including with some of our traditional partners, that we may one day have to respond to at home.
Minister Mahuta?
Well, it might well be a strategy that requires the David and Goliath kind of attitude. I mean, we are a small country, and the work that David's doing to ensure that we continue to advocate for fairness, we continue to uphold a rules-based system, we continue to promote a trade for all agenda which deepens the domestic economic benefits of what we're trying to achieve for our people here in New Zealand as we look out to market. All for bode well. And why? Because we're looking after our environment, we're looking after our people, we're reducing inequality by promoting fairness. So, you know, I think the post-COVID context requires that kind of a strategy.
I think you've both touched on some potential strengths that New Zealand has in this new environment, and one of the other ones that you referenced, Minister, was that we've got quite diverse range of markets that we can export to, and the strategy talks about refreshing our key trade relationships. What does refreshing those relationships mean for you?
Countries helping each other, recognising that that through international cooperation we are a better world and a more prosperous one. We've had our challenges in New Zealand as in other countries with some of the supply lines during the height of COVID, and although that was nerve-wracking at the time, we managed to get through in no small part through international cooperation with our traditional partners. And we've also helped other countries overcome their challenges caused by COVID. And I think, I really, we're a country that's so small, it's obvious that multilateralism is to the benefit of us and the world. We can't necessarily impose that view upon the rest of the world, but we can build out support for it by doing practical things and working with partners who share our values.
Do you think that there might also be some new opportunities that possibly we haven't thought about, or new partnerships out there, new market opportunities that we could explore?
Well, if I think about some of the stakeholder groups that I had the ability to meet with during the COVID period, one key message that came out from across every sector, primary sector, forest, land, food production, was that we should use the post-COVID context to develop our edge in terms of digital technology to be able to contribute more in that space. We don't have a well integrated system in this area. Many sectors said that much of what they do could be absolutely enhanced through e-commerce and a common platform, doing more in the IP sector and the digital tech sector. So I think there are real opportunities there, because what we are able to produce that can add value to traditional practices, I think, is a space still undiscovered to its full potential and can contribute a lot in the New Zealand context and to the world market.
Value often lies in complexity. If the complexity of what it is that we offer to the rest of the world grows through appropriate investment in research and development and the technologies that that innovation brings, then that is a key to prosperity. And it's interesting that I get reports from New Zealand Trade and Enterprise on how our technology firms are doing, and our technology firms have largely fared very well through this crisis. It's a rapidly growing part of our economy, and I think we have to continue to support it in order to diversify the mix of what it is that we sell to the rest of the world.
In your remarks, you referenced that this strategy is a significant what is required is a significant recalibration of New Zealand's approach to trade policy. What looks different for you as we go forward into this new reality?
Well, in the short to medium term, it's actually the support that we need to give to exporters in market. They can't travel themselves. It's harder for them to form new relationships. They can make connections, obviously, via the internet with agents, but it's pretty hard for them to assess market risk and who's reliable or not. The network of posts that we have around the world through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, who often co-locate with New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, is probably the most important resource that we can offer additional support through at the moment.
Minister, anything
Well,
to
one
add?
of the reasons I argued too, and David supported me around having an associate trade minister with an emphasis on the Māori economy, was the opportunity to deepen the potential of Indigenous agreements and partnerships and what that could leverage both ways. But knowing that many other Indigenous countries look to New Zealand in key areas that could assist them, that seemed to me to be a platform that we have not yet fully discovered its true potential and what the economic opportunity arising out of those relationships could create. So I'm very focused and narrow in that focus perhaps, but it's for a bigger advantage. I believe in the Indigenous trade space there are real opportunities that could be leveraged for our country to support our economy, but also to support like economies who are challenged with being included as serious contributors to lifting the well-being of their people.
When we think about New Zealand putting itself on the world map and strengthening relationships, APEC 2021 was an amazing opportunity there. Would either of you like to comment about how you see that opportunity now and how that might be going to operate next year?
Well, we don't know, is the truth of it. Because of the disruption to this year's event, it will have knock-on effects to subsequent years, and we're really not sure how that falls as yet. I think Malaysia have been quite clear that they want to delay their year till next year, but what the knock-on effects of that are in subsequent periods is not yet clear.
Yeah. How important is APEC and our regional relationships?
Well, we've got to make every multilateral institution, we've got to do our best to make sure that they continue to work. And there's pressure on just about all of them at the moment. APEC didn't have a particularly successful year last year because of some issues in the host country, and this year is disrupted by COVID. The WTO has had its own share of frustrations in recent years and is moribund. So we try and unlock those gridlocks everywhere we find them, including through APEC. In some ways, APEC becomes relatively more important given the problems that there are in other broader churches, if you like the WTO. So we see APEC as important.
Yeah. What role does international investment play in the economic and trade recovery for New Zealand?
Well, foreign direct investment's always been part of New Zealand's economic history and remains important. The main channel for foreign direct investment is actually through bank lending in New Zealand, and that's probably likely to remain the case. Our growing technology companies are often reliant upon larger markets in order to maximise their own potential. And they often choose to accept foreign capital as part of that growth journey in order to both facilitate the growth and the size of their firms, but also with some of the connections that it brings to other market economies. That said, one of the reasons that has been a route of choice for some companies has been the paucity of capital available to expanding technology firms in the New Zealand market, and that's one of the reasons why earlier this year we launched a fund to assist in early stage ventures getting their sort of second and third round capital funding, not to prevent them from accessing capital from overseas, which is a choice for them, but to try and ensure that they were doing that for the right reasons rather than because of a lack of adequacy of that part of the New Zealand capital market.
A lot of the conversation we've had is around this sort of term trade architecture and trying to reinvigorate trade architecture. We've talked a little bit about some aspects of that, but perhaps you could say a little bit more about what you think that means in the context of either the WTO or potentially some new bilateral agreements or I think open plurilateral agreements as the term is, and what that might look like for us.
Well, you know, this concept of open plurilaterals goes back through successive governments, actually, going back to P4, which was the precursor to CPTPP, where New Zealand, with some of our closest trade parties, chose to negotiate a set of rules that they thought would be appealing to other countries. And so it proved to be with CPTPP, which proved to probably the most significant large trade agreement in the world in the last decade, I would suggest. Taking that concept forward, we've found that sometimes small countries like New Zealand and some of our smaller like-minded partners can agree fair rules in other areas. And we've got a couple of them on the go at the moment. We've got a digital partnership with Singapore and Chile, which tries to write some rules that are fair in respect of digital trade. We think we're getting ahead of some of the multilateral processes which seem to be mired by delay and sometimes hostage taking by one party or another to those negotiations. Another example is an agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability, which we're negotiating with Costa Rica, Fiji, Iceland, Norway and Switzerland. Have I got that right? Is that right? That's the right list. The list gets much longer and I'll forget it, but we've also got interest being in Switzerland. And Switzerland. Yeah. Did I say it? Oh, I've said it twice now. Sorry about that. And that tries to achieve improvements in trade in a way that benefits the climate, because we think using the wellbeing budget framework that Grant Robertson's adopted for the budget, it's an example of how we're trying to integrate environmental outcomes with trade policy so that they push in the same direction rather than against each other.
Well, I think the thing that we will see that's different, that is underpinned by the Trade for All agenda, is the public interface of trade policy. And that's very important to us, because no longer will it be people hidden away in a room negotiating some agreement that has no practical value for the people back home. So we're very mindful of that. We're very mindful of needing to engage the public in the conversation around how our trade policy benefits our national interest and what we might expect to see as we deepen the economic flow and benefits back to New Zealand. Probably at this juncture I should acknowledge the establishment of Te Taumata, which MFETA have been using as an advisory body on aspects that impact on Māori. So, for example, the digital partnerships that were referred to, that's a new area where Te Taumata were able to really understand that, have some engagement with Māori around the flow-on benefits and opportunities there, and to some extent provide a really healthy discourse around, how trade agreements going forward into the future could have these other benefits. So I see that as a real, key characteristic of the Trade for All agenda and approach, and the benefits it could deliver to New Zealand. Yeah.
In terms of thinking of some of our major trading relationships, often it's observed that we're quite reliant on a few big partners, not just Australia, but China, also a very important market for New Zealand. What's your view about the level of diversification we have at the moment, or where there might be risks or opportunities in that space?
Well, I suppose the first point I would make is that our existing relationships are our most valuable ones, really. A bird in the hand's worth two in the bush. And diversification decisions are really not so much made by government as by the individual firms. Having said that, I can recall a conversation that I had about a year ago with some of the rock lobster participants who were 100% reliant on the Chinese market. Now, that was a very profitable strategy for them because they were getting a better price in China than they would get anywhere else. And that was made possible in part because of the terms of our free trade agreement with China. That company obviously suffered some disadvantage when the early stages of the pandemic were felt first in China. But that was a consequence of the decision that private enterprise company made for themselves. Now, you can see companies that have had their supply chains disrupted looking at whether they should diversify them, whether they should take steps to mitigate those risks for the future. Those are decisions for them. The best that we can do is maximise their low tariff choices through trying to advocate for better access into all world markets.
Do you, often one of the terms that's come up in the context of thinking about COVID and people's reactions to it has been a questioning potentially of globalisation and what this means. Some countries have talked about being self-sufficient in certain essential products or potentially self-sufficient in food. What sort of themes are you hearing when you connect with your colleagues and counterparts globally, and how do you see that sort of global dialogue playing out around the benefits of globalisation?
Do you you want to go first?
I don't think the dust has settled on any of that conversation. We're still in, really, from a global context, we are still in the middle of many countries trying to respond to the immediate challenge in front of them. So, as I say, I don't think the dust has settled on how things will look in a post-COVID context, but we can be responsible as a very small country, having now been in a position to reflect on the response to date and casting out what needs to be our recovery strategy. We believe that there is a continued emphasis on engaging in markets, reorienting domestically to support the move from volume to value, being able to now invest, think about seriously how we strategically invest in areas that could really get uptake and improve the way in which our businesses are able to participate in a post-COVID context. So, yeah, the dust hasn't settled, and I think it would be premature right now to actually cast anything too set in concrete. That's my view anyway. Yeah.
I don't disagree. I agree.
Excellent. Yeah. So what happens now with this strategy? What's the next steps, and what sort of action and engagement can we expect to see?
Well, as we speak, NZTE, for example, are increasing their capacity in offshore offices so as to deliver the services that are funded in the latest budget. We are continuing to push forward with negotiating rounds virtually with our trading partners. We're bringing to a conclusion the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, which is signed at the end of this week virtually between countries. So MFAT is progressing every aspect of that which we have talked about.
Anything further?
Yeah, I support that too. I mean, we're having this conversation today because as people are very much focused on the now and our response to the COVID challenge that we have in front of us, I think our assurance is that there is a strategy around how the economy recovers and what the strategy is in terms of our productive sector and what that looks like as we seek out opportunities and get things ready for when the world opens back up. We might be ahead of the game in some ways, but actually it gives us good time to invest on the areas where there is an opportunity for us to reorient. So I think about the Māori economy. This is the time now, and I'm clearly signalling to various sectors, this is the time now where the best thing we can do is actually plan for how we can reset and be contributing in a much stronger way to the economic recovery. But actually, I'm behind the 8 ball because the sector have said we thought about that from week one when lockdown occurred, and that's encouraging. That's encouraging. So, challenges ahead, but certainly opportunities. The recovery strategy and the immediate focus on business support for our SME sector, I believe, will have a significant positive impact on the Māori economy. And I welcome the collaboration and coordination of that effort right now.
We haven't talked too much about our imports and our reliance on the world to supply us with some of the things that we don't produce here in New Zealand. I wonder if you wanted to add anything about our confidence that we can get the necessary goods and other inputs that we need to be able to be successful here in New Zealand.
Well, I think the last few months proves that we can. Everyone's seen news about how it took a while to ramp up the production of reagents for the DNA tests to detect COVID, but those systems still worked. New Zealand, which is reliant on those international supply lines for test kits, has had one of the highest rates of testing in the world, and we've done that from those international supply lines. It has required some intervention at a government, at a minister to minister or departmental to departmental level at times, and at times like that you do rely upon your traditional relationships, but they've worked. I find that really reassuring. We've got, in Fisher and Paykel Healthcare, we've got a firm that supplies an absolutely essential part to the majority of high-end, or a huge percentage of high-end ventilators that are produced around the world. And they've managed to get their inward supply lines of parts to keep this going through this, worse than 100-year pandemic, and getting their outward goods flowing. So although the system has been stretched at times, it's still worked even for a country positioned at the bottom of the world, distant from other markets.
Mm. What do you think is some of the most important opportunities that we've got that the crisis might have created for us? There's always two sides to a challenge, isn't there? There's an opportunity that might come through. What do you think they might be for New Zealand?
Food. Assurance. People are being assured about the quality of food that we're producing here in New Zealand, and it's the trust and aspect of it. I think more and more, and we haven't yet assessed the value that other countries are going to put on the quality of food that we have always produced here in New Zealand, but the greater assurance around that whole food production pipeline. The other area could well be that we are continuing to specialise in the areas where we know we're good at, and the Minister spoke about that in the speech. And we're not going to be the country that's going to be making cars. We're going to be the country that builds on what we know we are already doing well and continue to do it even better. And the value that other countries put on that and seek out from us those things, I think will tell us inadvertently what we must continue to focus on. Proteins. These are all things that are already within our ecosystem of production.
Yeah, I have a similar view. I think we have to work to maximise the value that is attached to New Zealand's attributes, or our brand. Trustworthiness, freedom from corruption, honouring contracts, respect for human rights and civil liberties, democracy, fair trading relationships, respect for science, and the success that we've experienced as a country doing so well with COVID. All of those things, our environmental story, middle of COVID, we're actually still taking steps forward on water quality. All of these things, I think, underpin New Zealand's place in the world, and we have to maximise the value that we can bring home to New Zealand from those attributes as we trade with the rest of the world.
What, if we think about food products in particular, often it is quite a protected area. That is where there is some protectionism that comes through. So how can this strategy help us to make sure that our wonderful food products are actually able to get to consumers who will value what we produce?
Well, if you mean the transport links, we've got to, for our high value perishable goods, we've got to maintain air links, and that requires government support at the moment. That won't last forever. Those routes will eventually stand on their own feet again, but those interventions are both necessary and justifiable at the moment. In terms of what it is that we offer people, as Minister Mahout has already said, we offer people high quality goods that they can rely upon, both from a food safety and quality point of view, but also as representative of a lot of the other values that I think discerning consumers around the rest of the world value. I know that Damien O'Connor thinks that we should pitch ourselves as being the purveyors of quality produce to the world's wealthiest and most discerning consumers in order to maximise the return that we get.
Anything to add to that, Minister?
Well, the only other thing I'd say in relation to food is the whole production chain, so enhanced technology, because it's not about supplying, as we know, the mass food products there, but the quality of the food product and the way that we use technology to continue to attribute better impacts on the environment, and greater efficiencies in the way we produce food. It all sits within the same kaupapa, the same basket.
Great. Well, that's a great place for us to finish. I think we've come to the end of the session. So can I just thank you both very, very much for spending this time with us and talking us through this new strategy. There is an email if people are wanting to provide some comments or ask any questions about it. I'll read that out for you. It's trade recovery, all one word, at mfat.govt.nz. So thank you once again, and
thanks, Sarah.
look forward to some comments coming through the website.
Thank you.